8 inches in diameter and about 3 to 4 feet long. It's got 3 different permanent mold releases on the part, divided into 3 sections. Each one has a little different characteristic of release and surface. It shows you a little bit about how the camera can zoom in close. It's at a 40 power zoom. As I mentioned earlier, the camera can be positioned in a couple of different ways. This one is showing how the camera can be independent of the mold. So the mold is allowed to turn around the camera without influencing it or without rotating it. It shows you the true position of the powder. It's riding somewhat up from center in the mold. This is 35 mesh linear low density polyethylene. You can see a little bit of the polymer beginning to stick to the back end of the mold. Now this is in a rock and roll machine. So right now the mold is running horizontally as I'm allowing it to heat up. The end in the center is already hot enough to accept powder for it to stick. You can see now as the mold begins, or as the oven begins to tilt backwards, and it takes the polymer down to cover the end that it adheres to the mold. Right, here's a later part of the cycle coming back for another layer. You can see the first layer that was put on there is already centered. You can see it's transparent again. I deliberately ran these molds a long time horizontal so we could see what was happening in the center. In a normal operation, you'd be rocking the mold a little more frequently than this. I'm omitting a lot of the parts of the video that are here that can get kind of boring, but parts where the powder comes back and covers the camera completely, I'm leaving that part out for now. You'll see some of that later. This is zooming in on some of the centering polyethylene materials. This is where the mold reverses direction. Most of the setup you see, I'll reverse directions every 1 minute. Another thing you'll notice here, see how coarse the powder is. We're late enough in the cycle that many of the fines have already been used up. So the last powder to lay down is a little coarser than the first powder. Remember, I am moving this mold a little more slowly than you would in production. If you get your stopwatch out, you can count the number of RPMs. That's going through the centering process. You can see it has a kind of a coarse texture to the surface of it. Most of the white that you see is the reflections off of the lights that are associated with my camera. As you can see, it looks almost cellular in nature, where the air bubbles and the between some of the parts and the cohesion of the materials pulled it up into separate entities. But as the temperature continues to rise, the air bubbles will dissipate into the melt and the polymer will lay down smoother and flatter. Now you can still see the dark spots, which are either air bubbles or the shadows of air bubbles against the surface. The polymer is almost cured. There's still a few air bubbles left, but it's smoothing out nicely. You can begin to read the numbers now through the polymer. Okay, now we're in the cooling phase. You can see you're starting to get a little bit of a translucent look to the material. And these are air cooled. I didn't use any water throughout any of the cycles that I used here for this video. There's the shrink. Material breaking loose from the mold.